Hi and welcome back to my channel. In this week's video you have the next episode of Recent Reads. I have 3 books to talk about, well 3.5 because of the length of the last one to talk about. One I'm going to start talking about first is one that I had to return to the library. It was probably still overdue. But that is the book Linked by Gordon Korman. And Gordon Korman is an author that I have read 2 books from previously that have been on the SCASL list, and I was a little bummed to see yet another one of his books on the list. However, out of the 3 that I have read, this is hands down the best of his that I have ever read. This book took me almost completely by surprise. When I was first analyzing the list of books, and I was looking at the rep that a lot of the books had, there was a surprising amount of Jewish rep. There are a few other books, including one other that I'm going to talk about next, that had Jewish rep in it, and I wondered, are they doing this so that they can say that they have rep in their list, even if they don't have a lot of other types of rep? But with this book, I'm almost certain that they chose it because of its quality. In this book, there is an incident that happens at a middle school where a swastika is drawn, and it causes a really big uproar. And this area is, I think, in Appalachia or near there, so of course they have a history of other not so great things that they have done, and the school jumps on it proactively, and they institute basically like this training, racial bias type training. I forget the way they described it in the book. And there are several characters whose points of view that you get. It's an ensemble cast. One of those characters, his dad is a big real estate developer in the area, and he is really excited that there's been this massive dinosaur find, and a lot of scientists have come in. There's been a big grant, and he basically wants to make it the Orlando of like a dino park sort of thing. And he's really worried about the attention that is getting placed on their town because of this. And another character is a daughter of one of the scientists' pairs. Their family is Jewish, and they've, practiced the tradition for a really long time. And of course, when the swastika gets drawn, all the attention goes towards her. There are a couple other kids who have perspective. So one is Latinx, but I think it's Puerto Rican or Dominican. I don't remember which one. And he's in charge of the art club. And so of course, at first, the attention is on him because it was done in paint. And he actually was the one to find it because he left something in his locker accidentally and went back in, and he's the one that discovered it. But you have this whole cast coming together, and the school trying to solve their image and basically like pound it in, don't do this sort of thing. But the swastikas keep getting drawn. And the school, one of the other characters is the 7th grade class president, and she really wants to do something. She's always tried to get kids involved in student government. And she comes up with the idea of making paper chains with each link representing one of the victims of the Holocaust. And it's supposed to be modeled after another school, a real life school, who had done this with paper clips, not linking them together, but just getting all of them so you could see the number of them. And so eventually the whole town gets involved. And there is something that changes for that kid whose dad's the real estate developer that I'm not going to mention, but he plays a far more prominent role, not the dad, the kid, than you would think. And the way that things are revealed and the way that they're taught, and the kids learn these lessons, and they're real and they're human, and they screw up, they make terrible mistakes, but they learn from it. There were multiple times while I was reading this book, I was listening to it as an audiobook, where I was listening to it and I was cross-stitching, and I had to stop because I couldn't see because I was crying. It moved me more than a lot of other books have, and it just had such a powerful emotional impact. It really deals with the consequences of our actions and what it means to actually believe it or not realize what you've done, but then realize the severity of your actions afterwards and still want to learn and grow. I struggle putting into words just how much that book impacted me. I've recommended it to my mom, and she's not really one that reads middle grade or even young adult. And I haven't had a chance to talk to her since she started reading it. She started reading it yesterday. So yesterday as of filming. I have a lot of really good books that I have read recently. Some really amazing books. I had what I still think will be one of my number ones, but I'm pretty sure that this one's going to end up on the top 10 because I don't really cry at books. And when it does that, yeah, I don't even have words for it. The next book is another SCASL book. And actually, all three of the ones that I completed this week are SCASL books. Linked was middle grade, but this one and the next one are young adult. This is the other book that had very prominent Jewish rep, The City Beautiful. It's classified as fantasy, but the fantasy is very light in this book. It's more like folktale oriented. So the setting of this book is the setting of the World Exposition in Chicago that is very well known and has been talked about a lot. Erik Larson had that book Devil in the White City talking about the famous serial killer. It's set around that time. And the main character is a young Jewish boy. I think he's 16 or 17. He might be 18. He is alone. He's by himself. He has roommates, basically, because on the way over, his father died. He and his father were coming over to earn money to send for his mom and his two sisters to bring them over. But on his way over, the dad contracts typhus and dies. So he's trying to work and earn money, and he's so close at the start of this to having enough money to bring over his family. But some things start shifting and changing, and the inciting incident basically is the death of his roommate, who he didn't acknowledge until much later he had a crush on. He is very involved with his Jewish roots, with the rituals and things that go along with being Jewish, and the difficulty that a lot of them had because they were Eastern European Jews and not the Western European Jews like Jews of German descent were, and who had already integrated themselves into society, like the Rothschilds. And most of these people were looked down upon severely, and all of the Jewish boys that he rooms with, there's 4 total, they're all of Eastern European descent. But so he volunteers at, I forget the name of it, I probably wouldn't be able to pronounce it correctly anyway. It's something that helps prepare the bodies for the burial rites, according to the religious traditions. He's there and he doesn't realize, like, his friend never came home. Like, he went off and did something and never came home. And then he's there volunteering and his friend's body is brought in. The police say that it's just, it's not a suspicious death. He was probably drunk and he tripped and he drowned in this very shallow water. Of course, it's a suspicious death. And there's been a series of young Jewish boys who have been going missing. And the fantastical part starts right about there, where it's basically the idea of, I think it's called a debuk. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but it's basically the spirit of his friend possesses him, but he's in his own, he has his own faculties, but it's not going to end well unless he gets the debuk out, because one body can't have 2 souls. But he's determined to avenge his friend and find out who was actually the murderer. There were several things in here that they were not my taste, but it didn't make me dislike the book. It just kept me at arm's length from a lot of what was going on. I honestly think this book would have been even more powerful without the fantastical element and just focusing on all the trauma already in his life, from being separated from his family, from having all these people die around him, from the prejudice that's inflicted against him, directed against him because he is Eastern European. The mystery going on. I think if you had kept all of that and just made it more of a historical mystery, I think I would have enjoyed it more. The fantastical, because it wasn't fully fantastical and it had so much of a foothold in reality, it just made it a little odd to me. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't like great and engaging and captivating. And I just don't know how engaged a more modern teen is going to be for something like this, especially because the fantasy is so light. Then we have another book where I read a little bit at the beginning of the past week, and then I really didn't read much, if any, physically throughout the week, but I finished it on Saturday. So if you looked on my Goodreads profile, it would say that I took a week to read this book. I didn't. I took basically a day, split into multiple parts. And so I actually picked this up shortly after finishing You Be Home Now by Catherine Glasgow, which was a book that dealt with the opioid crisis in a much better way than I had ever seen before. And this book is in the wild light, and I bring up You'd Be Home Now because this also has a little bit of the opioid crisis just because of the setting. It doesn't center on it, but it has tremendous impact on the main character and his best friend, because the main character is living with his grandparents, being raised by his grandparents in rural Tennessee because his mother OD'd and died. And his best friend, they met at basically like a support group for family members, teens who have parents or family members who are addicted. And so his best friend, her mom is still alive, but she's a junkie and she's constantly having to revive her with Narcan and etc. But she is absolutely brilliant. And shortly before the start of this book, she, with her friend, is able to discover this very rare type of bacteria that treats a lot of different disease-resistant strains, antibiotic-resistant strains of medicine, and she gets it to a scientist who publishes it, and she becomes sort of famous for this, and this really wealthy, prestigious academy in Connecticut offers her a scholarship. And she says, I will accept it only if you provide a scholarship for my friend as well. Because he's basically the only anchor and real thing in her life, him and his grandparents. And so they agree. And so there's a lot of hard things going on for the main character, because he really wants to support his friend, but he loves his grandparents, and his grandfather is probably not going to live long because he has chronic emphysema. He's just not doing well. And so he does not want to leave. He doesn't want to go from Tennessee to Connecticut and spend this time away from him. And he also has a bit of an inferiority complex. He compares himself to his friend, and he thinks, I'm only getting to go to this wealthy school because of my friend, not on my own merits. And so most of the book actually takes place at the school, and there's just so much that goes into this. And he ends up in this intro to poetry class where he's like, I just needed an English credit, I guess I'll take this. But it becomes so instrumental for him, and the professor becomes surrogate family. And she's the kind of teacher who every kid deserves. She's the kind that sees that there's a problem and reaches out and keeps pursuing. And she also shares cultural affinity with the main character because she also grew up in Appalachia, I think Kentucky. So it's a very heartwarming story that really looks at development and what these different relationships mean. And there's a bunch of different relationships that are studied, from friend relationships, family relationships, familial, and it's so well done. And it's not amazing, but it's another solid effort that looks at the effects of the opioid crisis and how that has carry-on effect generationally, and how do you learn and grow and heal from those sorts of things. And then the book that I am about halfway through, there's no bookmark because I'm listening to it on audiobook. I'm about 60% through, so I will hopefully finish it tomorrow, and I'll talk more about it then. But that is The Memory of Souls by Jen Lyons. I love the way this feels. I almost wish I was reading it physically because it's so nice and floppy, but I love the audiobook, and because of all the different footnotes, I've chosen to read this entire series via audiobook. It also helps that Hoopla has it, and this does not really have the same conceit as the previous books. It is a dual narration style. It's like back and forth with narration and telling different stories, but it doesn't have the time element involved that the first two did. There's one consistent stream to the story because a lot of the characters have come together, and then the other tangentially related part of the story, the other point of view chapters basically, have talked about several different things, and they've told a story to completion and then have shifted. And there was a part one, now I'm in part two. I don't know if that's going to change at all in later parts, but it may. So I'm still really enjoying it. I love these characters. I love this world. I have never enjoyed a complex, absolutely confusing, utterly compounding world like this one. Things don't make sense. I don't understand a lot of the relationships. I probably would have to sit down with a chart to like trace it all out to figure everything out. It's that confusing, but I love it. I almost love it because it's confusing. It's hard to say, but I will be finishing this quite soon. And that's it. That's all the books that I read this week. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.